This is just an excerpt from a full episode. If you enjoyed what you hear here, go check out other full episodes, either on YouTube or as part of the podcast feed. Enjoy! Government spending spree news now. Hodgepodge of bad takes and misleading opinions stitched together and brought to life by a mad journalist, Newscorp, has released this article, daring to lecture the public on wasted taxpayer money over monies spent on admittedly unconventional research after they themselves received at least $10 million in taxpayer money. The article in question is trying to get your mum angry about the false premise that Australian taxpayers are forking out millions of dollars for research into fringe topics like gender equity and jazz, and the link between parenting practices and socialism in Laos. Now, these things are being researched, but to imply that we are wasting taxpayer money on it is exactly the kind of petulant, "oh, what about me-ism" that I've come to expect from news.com.au, which is the digital news example of digging through your garbage for a scoop. Trying to turn the poor against each other for taking your money when really they should be angry at the government for providing an inadequate amount of compensation during a pandemic. But you wouldn't hear a bad word about the coalition, not while it's still profitable for Newscorp. You don't shoot the horse until after it's broken its leg. Education Minister and man constantly on alert for flash mobs of angry students, Dan Tehan, was one to sign off on the research, despite his penchant for kicking students out of their chosen degrees, insisting that ARC grants are only awarded to the highest quality researchers and research projects. So if you aren't sure, the ARC is the primary source of advice on the government on investment in the national research effort. And that is exactly why Newscorp is so upset. Murdoch stopped listening to experts a long time ago, round about the time that they started insisting that there was no such thing as global warming, replacing all experts with reckless opinion slingers, pew pew pew, the fastest hot takes in the Western media. Here we see Newscorp pretending to care about ordinary Australians, despite having Corey, too conservative even for the Liberal Party Bernardi, as a commentator dressed in news clothing, decrying the life-saving pandemic stimulus weeks before Victoria entered its second lockdown. And here they are, pretending to care about us ordinary families that struggle to pay the bills and put food on the table, followed by some fake outrage over where government money has been spent, as opposed to here, where the Courier Mail was suggesting about Michael McCormack's recent statements about JobKeeper recipients that the minister's dole bludger bashing was right. Then again here, we see them calling an admittedly criminal lady a dole bludger, and here we can see them doing it again, this time for a Taekwondo champion who stole from Centrelink. And look, maybe you think I am picking bad examples, as these people had actually engaged in some form of actual welfare theft. But that does bring me back to a little point that I've made on this show before. The government is stealing taxpayer money all the time, and nobody has introduced introduced a single one of them as some sort of dole-bludging tax cheat. And here, let's have a look at this. Newscorp again doing a deep dive into the biggest dole-bludger suburbs, also known as the suburbs that the underemployed are forced to live in because they're priced out of most every suburb and are struggling even on the paltry wage that they can scrape together from their underpaying, underemployment. And the nice thing is, I can point to almost any newspaper and find an example. As I don't know if I've already mentioned it, 70% of all the newspapers in Australia are owned by a man who finds the poor so disdainful he does everything that he can to make them angry at all times. That way they will turn on each other and they won't see that the thing that is actually causing them the most harm, dole-bludging newspapers, scraping up government money that could be going into our pockets, that could be sustaining our systems. These newspaper companies and media companies that take millions and millions of taxpayer dollars with little to no plan, sometimes without even applying, and occasionally to not do a job that it was given the very money to do. Like here, when Murdoch's company received a share of a $50 million subsidy to keep regional newspapers operated, and according to former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, quote, like most other things with Murdoch, when he says these titles will become digital only on their coverage, or will be streamlined into broader regional papers, it's a lie. This coverage will practically vanish. The proof is in the axing of 800 jobs, meaning that the local news dies. The former Australian Prime Minister added, I suppose the loss of those 800 jobs don't really count as ordinary Australians struggling to get by, as they have sucked at the dark nectar of Rupert Murdoch, fundamentally transforming them from humans with a capacity to care about other humans into an extension of the Newscorp hive mind. Speaking as one with a single thought and voice, dark and deep from within, almost otherworldly, as though it speaks from a darker dimension, when really the dark truth is the voice speaks from the same world as you and I come from. The terror is coming from inside the house. In October's federal budget, the government announced $1 billion in new research funding for Australian universities. This was to ease the financial pressures caused by a sharp drop-off in international students due to COVID-19. A fact that appears quite late in this article and is not repeated, and fails to explain that the money is simply, like most businesses at the moment, propping up a sector, not actually handouts. Because as truly, the money for these grants is normally funded by international students. A budget that no longer exists for a sector that wasn't being propped up by JobKeeper, even though some churches were, and they don't even pay taxes. And suddenly, how the money given to this sector to prop it up is spent is magically a concern. You know, if it's being used to prop up bonuses for bosses rather than to do its namesake and keep jobs, yeah, that is a concern. I have been receiving government money during the pandemic, and guess what? I've spent hundreds of dollars on chicken. But you'd never call it a waste of taxpayer money. Well, some of you might, but you shouldn't call it a waste of taxpayer money. Chicken, and its many various ways of being prepared, have been keeping me going during the months-long lockdown in Melbourne. You might even say that I was conducting a long-term study on the impact of consuming heroic amounts of chicken during a lockdown. And I can tell you, the results are in, and it makes me feel pretty damn good. Let's further examine the government spending. Back to New South Wales, the Groundhog Day of corrupt states. You know, like each time it's slightly different than the last time, but as far as we know, we will be stuck in this loop of corruption for all eternity. So, the New South Wales government has spent less than 13 million of its $50 million rescue package for arts organisations hit by the COVID-19 shutdown. A big surprise for a government that is determined to defund the arts sector with more fury than it would ever take to any sort of police force. Though it must be noted that the only thing that ever dies due to overfunding of the arts is a bad comedian on stage. When the scheme was first announced 6 months ago, the New South Wales government said the $50 million rescue and restart funding would be distributed in 2 rounds, with the second round of grant applications now actually open to access, which is roughly $30.1 million. But there is a small question of what happened to the mystery of the disappearing $7 million left over from the first round. See, they thought that we wouldn't notice because there's never any money in the arts. But the argument could be made, if they were so bold, that the disappearance of the $7 million is one hell of a magic trick. David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty disappear. So fucking what? The statue costs $5.4 million, and that is way under what we are making disappear here. It's time for New South Wales Arts Minister Don Harvey to don his top hat and cape and hit the road. He has a hell of an act on his hands. Now, look, traditionally you might argue that they make a disappeared object return. But you know what? That is played out. The real magic is in making something disappear forever, without a trace. Even the Roman Empire still has remnants left. They couldn't make it disappear entirely. Look guys, magic has moved on. It was doing card tricks in the street in leather pants and now it's making government money disappear. However, Guardian Australia has heard claims from industry sources that the $7 million was in fact dished out amongst New South Wales arts organisations at the Minister's discretion, outside the formal rescue and restart grant application processes, and that the process was conducted with ridiculous secrecy. Ridiculous Secrecy is actually the name under which Don Harvey is performing his touring magic show. Ridiculous Secrecy. He also does kids' parties and bar mitzvahs for those that are interested. And yet, Don's office denies that money has been dispersed at his discretion and said that the $7 million was a provision for vulnerable companies. Kind of like arts companies at the moment. Quite vulnerable because they can't put on shows. So, seems he has actually made the money reappear, but instead of reappearing as sustaining arts grants for a dying industry, it is reappearing as a best-selling fiction novel in which the protagonist, a handsome magician who is also a spy, has infiltrated a corrupt government and is siphoning off the money in order to get it out of the hands of the nefarious ne'er-do-wells and into the next major motion action picture, Ridiculous Secrecy. I'm looking forward to it when cinemas open again at some point ever. However, let's now move over to Canada, the preferred identity of Americans when they used to be allowed to travel. Just like an Australian overseas will not deny it if you confuse them with a New Zealander. It's a pretty safe identity to have at the moment. In fact, we hope that your confusion becomes legally binding. Artists across Canada are facing demands from the Canada Revenue Agency, the Canadian equivalent of the ATO, asking that they repay emergency coronavirus benefits. The agency is also insisting that some artists are not eligible for payments under new income supports, leaving them to wonder why they have been excluded and how they're going to get by. Taking the self-perpetuated myth of the struggling artist to its natural conclusion, a state-mandated period of artistic suffering and depression to act as a muse in order to usher in a Canadian Renaissance. It's been a long time since we've had a Renaissance, and frankly I think we're overdue. We've had 2 pandemics, 2 world wars, and 2 movies set in the grown-up cinematic universe. But only one recognised period of enlightenment and artistic development and discovery? For shame. We have had marvels that those blundering fools could never dared have dreamed of, like shoes with rolly wheels in them. The wonders. Look, the problem at issue here is that the CRA statement states that artistic grants do not count as income for the purposes of meeting the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit threshold. Now, to be eligible, recipients must have had at least $5,000 in net income in 2019, or the 12 months preceding their application. Although the CRA has been telling artists that such grants don't count as income under the CERB program. They do count as income at tax time, however. You see, the thing about art is, its fundamental job, assuming that jobs in the arts still exist as anything more than a quaint footnote in history, is to make people question the nature of existence. And these artists are simply too good at their job. They have caused the Canadian Revenue Agency to question the very nature of the money that they have given, to ask that most fundamental of questions asked by artists: what even is income? If such a thing can be defined, when is income not income? Well, when it is given by the government, it seems, bringing to question the nature of a minister's salary. Is it truly to be considered income, as it was given by the government and not truly earned, and without it they would not have earned more than $5,000 in the previous year? And if it is an income, can they have income tax returns? Turning the whole artistic expression into more of a philosophy doctorate. And we can all agree, nobody wants to fund philosophers. Go back to pondering the fundamental questions of existence, you pretentious slacker wannabes. Who do you think you are? No, really, in the grand picture of things, who are you? What do you stand for? And why are you? At least have the courage to admit that you don't want to work just like the rest of us. Don't try and pass off your intention to form a oneness with your couch as a quiet introspection. That's not a meditative state. I heard you snoring. You were napping.